Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. So today we're diving deep into something you guys specifically requested. We're talking about the history and the significance of testing and measurement.
Oh, wow.
And, I think everybody listening has probably taken a lot of tests throughout their lives.
Right.
But, have you ever stopped to think about where those tests came from or what they really mean?
No.
Well, get ready to have your minds blown because we're about to uncover some truly fascinating insights about the world of testing. It's way more interesting than just multiple choice and true or false. I can promise you that.
Yeah. I think what's so fascinating is that testing is such a huge part of our lives, but we often don't even think about it. It's just there sort of in the background. But it has such a profound influence on everything we do. And what's really cool is that this isn't some new modern invention.
Right.
This goes way back. I mean, way back. Formal testing has been around for centuries.
Okay, so get this. Our sources say that formal testing can be traced as far back as 2200 BCE in ancient China. They had this elaborate system of exams that were used for civil service positions. Can you imagine needing to demonstrate archery skills to get a job delivering mail?
That's pretty wild. Makes you think about going postal in a whole new way, right?
Right.
But really, though, this ancient system is a great example of how some of the core ideas behind testing have been around for so long. They needed to figure out who had the right skills for certain jobs, just like we do today. It's all about selection and placement, finding the right fit.
So are you telling me that there's a connection between ancient archery exams and, like, the SATs we take today?
It's all connected.
That's mind-blowing.
It really is.
Well, what happened to that Chinese system, though? Did they just stop doing it?
It's not that simple. It's more nuanced. While the West was going all in on testing in the 20th century, China actually moved away from its exam-focused system around the same time.
Really?
Yeah. It's a good reminder that the role of testing and how people view it can change a lot depending on culture and the time period.
That's a good point. And speaking of changing views, one of the things our sources highlighted is how often testing is in the news these days. It seems like we're constantly debating the role of testing and how it impacts people.
Absolutely. And that debate actually has roots that go surprisingly far back. It's interesting to think about how Charles Darwin's work played a role in all of this.
Wait, Darwin. As in survival of the fittest Darwin. What does he have to do with testing?
Well, his work on individual differences, while not directly about testing, kind of helped to spark this whole quest to measure and understand human variation.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection here.
Right. And that's where Darwin's cousin Francis Galton comes in.
Oh, yeah, Galton.
He was completely obsessed with measuring everything about humans, literally everything. His motto was, wherever you can, count.
I like this guy already. Data for everything. Wasn't he the one who set up that anthropometric lab where he measured all sorts of human characteristics?
Yep, that's him. A true pioneer. He measured physical traits, sensory abilities, even reaction times. It was meticulous work, and it laid the foundation for later psychologists like James Cattell.
Ah, Cattell. Didn't he develop some of the first mental tests?
Exactly. He took Galton's ideas and ran with them.
So we're talking about the early steps towards things like the IQ tests and personality assessments that we have today.
Precisely. And that brings us to the early 1900s, a pivotal time for testing. This is when Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon entered the scene.
Oh, I've heard of them. They're the ones who developed intelligence tests for Parisian school children, right?
That's right. But their work wasn't limited to just the classroom.
Oh, yeah.
They used those tests in all sorts of settings. It really showed how versatile testing could be for understanding human behavior and potential.
Interesting. And isn't that where the famous Stanford Binet test comes from? The one that's still widely used today?
You got it. Louis Terman at Stanford University adapted Binet and Simon's work, and that gave us the Stanford Binet intelligence scales.
Wow. So innovations from over a century ago are still shaping how we assess intelligence today. It's incredible.
It really is. And we can't forget about the impact of world events like World War I and World War II.
Oh, yeah. I bet the need to assess huge numbers of military personnel must have really pushed the field forward.
Absolutely. Those wars led to major advancements in both intelligence testing and personality testing. They needed tests for recruitment placement, even for identifying soldiers who might be susceptible to stress. It was a crucial time for the field.
It sounds like those wartime advancements didn't stay confined to the military, though. Our sources mentioned a huge surge in all kinds of tests after those wars. Schools, hospitals, businesses, you name it.
Exactly. It was like a testing boom. New types of tests were being developed left and right to meet all sorts of needs. Our sources actually list a bunch of categories. Achievement tests, personality tests, aptitude tests, ability or intelligence tests, neuropsychological tests, and vocational tests.
Okay, that's a lot of tests. It's amazing to see how much the field has evolved and branched out.
It has. And the story doesn't end there. The field of testing is constantly adapting and changing. New technologies changing needs, and of course, those ongoing debates about how testing is used and its implications.
So it's not just about remembering some historical figures and dates. This is a living, breathing field that's still being shaped today.
Exactly. And I think understanding the history of testing is key to understanding where we are now and where we're headed in the future. It gives us the context to grapple with those current debates about fairness, accuracy, and the role of testing in making important decisions.
You know what I'm realizing? This is so much more than I expected. It's like we've been uncovering this whole hidden world that's been influencing my life without me even realizing it.
It is a hidden world, isn't it? And a pretty powerful one at that.
Yeah, it really is.
So now that we've set the stage with the historical context, I think it's time to dive into those different categories of tests.
Okay, let's do it. I'm ready to unpack what each type of test is all about, how they're used, and what makes them unique.
All right, so let's start with achievement tests. These are all about measuring what you've actually learned in a specific subject or area. Think of those end-of-year exams you took in school, or maybe even those certification exams you might take for a specific job skill.
Got it. So, like, if I wanted to know how well someone understands calculus or can operate a certain piece of equipment, I'd give them an achievement test.
Exactly. It's all about measuring what they currently know and what they can do in that particular area.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about personality tests? Those seem a lot different.
Yeah, they're definitely a different beast. Personality tests try to get at those more nuanced aspects of who we are, our traits, our attitudes, even our emotional makeup.
So they're trying to capture those enduring patterns of thought and behavior that make each person unique.
That's the idea. They can give us insights into our strengths and weaknesses and how we interact with the world around us. Some people find them incredibly insightful, while others are a little more skeptical.
Yeah, I could see that. It's tempting to want those definitive answers about yourself from a personality test.
Right?
But I think it's important to remember that those tests are just one piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely.
They can be great conversation starters
Yeah.
and helpful for self-reflection. But we shouldn't be using them to, like, put people in boxes.
Totally agree. They're tools for exploration and understanding, not for labeling people. So have you ever taken an aptitude test?
I think I took one back in high school. It was supposed to help me figure out what kind of career path I might be good at. Felt a bit like a fortune teller trying to predict my future.
I know what you mean. Aptitude tests try to measure your potential for success in a certain area. Could be a skill set, a type of work, an academic field.
So they're not saying you'll definitely be successful in that area, but they're looking for those indicators that suggest you might thrive there.
Exactly. It's based on this idea that certain abilities and traits can be good predictors of success. But of course, it's not a guarantee. Our choices and efforts play a huge role, too.
Makes sense. Aptitude tests can give you some direction, but they don't determine your destiny. All right, so let's talk about the big one, intelligence tests.
Ah, yes, the one
So-
that gets everyone talking.
I remember taking those IQ tests when I was younger. I always felt so high pressure.
I can relate. Intelligence tests have generated a ton of discussion and debate over the years. The basic goal is to assess your overall cognitive abilities, things like problem-solving, reasoning memory.
But those aren't the only tests that look at brain function, right? We also have those neuropsychological tests.
You're right. Neuropsychological tests are a bit more specialized. They really zoom in on how the brain is working and how that relates to behavior, emotions, thinking. They're often used to assess for things like brain injuries, learning disabilities, or developmental disorders.
So if someone was having trouble with memory or attention, a neuropsychological test could help figure out what's going on and then guide treatment.
Exactly. They're incredibly valuable for understanding how the brain is functioning and pinpointing where someone might need some extra help. And then finally, we have those vocational or career tests, which are all about helping people figure out what kind of work might be a good fit for them.
Okay, those seem pretty straightforward. They look at your interests, your skills, and your values, and then try to match them up with potential career paths.
You got it. They can be super helpful for students who are exploring their options or for adults who are thinking about making a career change. In fact, I remember taking one of those career interest inventories in college, and it actually suggested that I might be well suited for a career in podcasting.
Well, look at you now. Proof that those tests can be pretty insightful. But as with any test, it's important to see them as a starting point, not the final word.
Couldn't agree more. It's all about using these tools thoughtfully and in combination with other forms of self-discovery and guidance.
Okay, so we've covered the different types of tests, but I'm curious about the how. How were these tests actually made? Is it as simple as just like coming up with a bunch of questions and calling it a day?
Oh, it's definitely not that simple. There's a whole science to it. It's a pretty involved process with multiple steps to ensure the test is valid and reliable.
Hmm. Okay, so walk me through it. Where do you even begin?
Well, first you have to be crystal clear about what you want to measure. Are you looking at a specific skill, a personality trait, an aptitude for something? You need to define that target really clearly.
That makes sense. You can't just throw any old questions together and expect to get meaningful results.
Yeah.
But what happens next? Once you know what you want to measure, how do you actually go about measuring it?
So that's when you decide on the format. Will it be multiple choice questions, essays, simulations, maybe something else entirely?
Ah, I see.
The format needs to be appropriate for whatever you're trying to measure and for the people you're testing.
So like a test for little kids will probably look way different from a test for adults, even if they're both trying to measure the same basic concept.
Exactly. And then comes the development of the test items themselves, the actual questions or tasks that make up the test. This involves a lot of research, brainstorming, piloting. You need to make sure those questions are clear, relevant, and that they're actually measuring what they're supposed to.
I imagine there's a lot of trial and error in that process.
Oh, for sure. It's a very iterative process. You're gathering feedback, analyzing data, and revising those items until they meet some pretty high standards.
So those standardized tests we hear so much about didn't just magically appear out of nowhere.
Nope. There's a whole science behind them. A lot of work goes into creating a good test.
That's fascinating. And I guess even after a test is developed, it's important to keep reviewing and updating it, right? To make sure it stays relevant and effective.
Absolutely. The world is constantly changing, and our understanding of human behavior and abilities is evolving too. Tests have to keep up with all of that.
Right. It all makes sense. This is so interesting. I had no idea how much goes into the world of testing.
It really is a whole hidden world with a huge impact on our lives, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's like we've been taking tests our whole lives without really understanding what's going on behind the scenes.
Well, I think we've done a pretty good job today of pulling back the curtain and getting a glimpse behind those scenes. We've explored the history, the different types of tests, the reasons why we test, and even the process of how tests are developed. But there's one crucial piece we haven't really touched on yet. How do we analyze all that test data?
Oh, right. We've talked about test scores, but we haven't really dug into how to interpret them and make sense of them.
That's where it gets really interesting, and that's where the world of statistics comes into play.
Okay, statistics. Now that's where I start to get a little lost.
Yeah.
But I'm definitely curious to see how it all works in the context of testing. All right, statistics. Let's do it. I got to be honest, stats aren't exactly my forte, but I'm totally intrigued to see how it all works when we're talking about testing.
You know, it's really not as intimidating as it might seem. Think of statistics as like a toolbox filled with different tools that help us make sense of data. It's like having this powerful lens that can reveal patterns and insights that you wouldn't be able to see just by looking at raw numbers.
Okay, I like that analogy.
Yeah.
So we're not just staring at a jumble of numbers, we're using statistics to actually give those numbers meaning.
Exactly.
So where do we even begin with all of this?
We have to remember that raw test scores don't really tell us much on their own.
Right.
It's the statistical analysis that provides context and turns those scores into something useful. It's like if you're baking a cake, right?
Oh,
You
yeah.
have all the raw ingredients, but it's the recipe that brings it all together. Statistics is kind of like that recipe for data.
I love that. So how do we choose the right recipe or the right statistical approach for analyzing the data from a test?
It really depends on the type of test and what questions we're trying to answer. Let's say we're looking at the results of an achievement test that a bunch of students took. One common approach is to calculate the average score, the mean. This gives us a general idea of how the group performed overall.
Right. So if the average score on, let's say, a math test is an 85%, we know that on average, the students did pretty well.
Right.
But that doesn't tell us the whole story, does it?
No, it doesn't. We also need to know how spread out those scores are. Are they all clustered closely around the average, or is there a lot of variation?
Oh, okay.
And that's where measures of variability come in, like the standard deviation.
So a small standard deviation means the scores are pretty similar, while a large standard deviation means there's more of a range in performance.
Exactly. And then there are statistical techniques that let us compare groups, like maybe comparing scores between different schools or even looking at differences based on gender or other factors.
Okay, that makes sense. That would be helpful for spotting patterns and maybe even identifying areas where certain groups might need more support. But what about individual scores? How do we figure out what a single person's score on a test actually means?
That's where norms come to play.
Norms.
Yeah. Norms are basically established by giving the test to a large representative sample of people and then figuring out the average score and the distribution of scores for that group.
So like if I take a test and get a score of, let's say, 115 mile, I can compare my score to the norms for people my age and see where I fall within that larger group.
Exactly. Norms provide a benchmark for interpreting individual scores. They help us understand if a score is high, low, or average relative to other people who have taken the same test.
Wow, this is all starting to make sense. It's amazing to see how statistics can take something like a test score, which seems pretty straightforward, and unlock so much information.
Right.
But I can also see how it could get really complex, especially when you start using those more advanced statistical techniques.
It definitely can. But at the end of the day, statistics is just a tool to help us make sense of data.
Right.
It's about taking those numbers and turning them into meaningful insights.
And those insights can then guide our actions and decisions, right? Whether it's
Right.
about individual students or job applicants or even like shaping educational policies on a larger scale.
Exactly. The whole point of testing and measurement is to give us information that we can use to make better, more informed decisions. Ideally, to create a world that's more equitable for everyone.
Wow, what a journey. We've gone from ancient archery exams to the complexities of statistical analysis. We've covered so much ground today.
We have, and I think it's a powerful reminder that testing is this constantly evolving field with a rich history and a huge impact on all of our lives.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought to ponder. We've talked a lot about the power of tests and all the insights we can gain from them. But what are the potential downsides of relying too much on test scores without taking into account the bigger picture of a person's experiences and circumstances?
That's a great question. It's so important to remember that test scores are just one piece of information among many. They don't tell the whole story about a person's worth or potential.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the fascinating world of testing and measurement. We encourage you to keep exploring, questioning, and engaging with this ever-evolving field. Until next time.
Thanks for listening, everyone.